On today's episode of the Black Studies Podcast, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. M. Keith Claybrook Jr., Associate Professor of Africana Studies at CSU Long Beach, where he teaches classes on Black history, research methods, and critical thinking. He is also advisor of the Black Student Union and Black Business Student Association. Dr. Claybrook served 2 terms as Vice President of the Black Faculty and Staff Association and currently serves in his 2nd term as the faculty co-chair. He has also served on the President's Equity and Change Commission at CSU Long Beach. He regularly attends conferences such as the National Conference of Black Studies, National Conference, the African Heritage Studies Association, 6th Region Diaspora Caucus Conference, and other conferences where he has presented on a diversity of topics, including the Black Freedom Movement, Black Students Movement, History of Black Los Angeles, African American Intellectual History, Educational History, African Deep Thought and Critical Thinking, Identity and Consciousness, Reparations, Hip Hop, and African-Centered Pedagogy. Claybrook is also a WICHE Academy for Leaders in the Humanities Fellow. He has also been recently elected to the Executive Board of the African American Cultural Center of Long Beach. Dr. Claybrook is the author of Building the Basics, a handbook for pursuing academic excellence in Africana studies, which offers tips, tidbits, and suggestions for studying at home, African deep thought and critical thinking, critical reading and questioning, scholarly writing, working collaboratively in groups, and preparing for quizzes and exams. He is also a lifetime member and regular contributor to Black Perspectives, which is the award-winning blog of the African American Intellectual History Society, and is the leading online platform for public scholarship on global Black thought, history, and culture. Claybrook has also published in the International Journal of Africana Studies, the Journal of Black Studies, the Journal of African American Studies, and Africology, the International Journal of Pan-African Studies. He has lent his expertise to Today in LA on NBC4, KJLH's Front Page with Dominique DePrima, KPCC NPR on Air Talk with Larry Mantle, and other television, print, and internet media outlets. He has also participated in many community programs and events. He is currently collaborating with colleagues to write a book on the Black Freedom Movement in Los Angeles, as well as another project which will publish an introductory workbook on African deep thought and African-centered approach to critical thinking. Claybrook earned his doctorate in cultural studies with a certificate in Africana studies from Claremont Graduate University. His dissertation was entitled Student Engagement, Cultural Politics, and the Black Students Movement, a case study in Los Angeles, 1965 to 1975. He holds an MA in General Education with a concentration in Intercultural Education from Loyola Marymount University, where his master's culminating project was entitled African Identity and Consciousness, a survey of formal education in Tanzania, Ghana, and the United States. Claybrook also holds 2 bachelor's degrees from Loyola Marymount, with the first in African American Study with a concentration in history, and a 2nd degree in history with a concentration in Africa, with a subfield in medieval European history. He has taught at Compton Community College, CSU, Dominguez Hills, and was born and raised in Compton, California. Claybrook is married with 4 children. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. M. Keith Claybrook Jr., Associate Professor of Africana Studies at CSU Long Beach. How are you doing today, Dr. Claybrook?
I'm doing well. How are you today?
Doing pretty well. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. So let's dive in. So how did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to the field of Black Studies?
So that's in thinking about this, lots of things have gone through my head. So there's the personal, and then there's the academic. It's interesting because until recently, I never really thought of myself as a reader. I'm not one that, grew up like there was always books in the house, but I wasn't really reading. But when I reflected on it, anytime there was, you remember like you have those like scholastic book fairs, and you go to the school and buy the books, or they send you home with little things and you can select the books. I always ordered books, and my parents always got me whatever I wanted. And I didn't think about this until much later, but the books that I would get were always on Black folks. Always. Fiction, nonfiction, it didn't matter. I wasn't, aware at the time to know if the author was black or not. That wasn't, where I
Mhm.
was. But if there was a picture of a black person, if the story was about black people, I was getting it and I did read it, you know. And so I'm a kid when Dr. King's birthday became a holiday. And so I remember that kind of vividly. And all of the celebratory programs and music and all the different things that were going on. So I kind of just like grew up in that. But my parents are not what you would call like, like the pro black. They were in the movement, like none of that. That
Mhm.
wasn't the household that I grew up in. But as I'm moving, through my childhood, whatever I was interested in, my parents did always support. And I remember when the National Council of Negro Women hosted and launched the National Black Family Reunions. And when it started in LA, I went to at least one, maybe two. So I'm involved, I'm around all of this, right? Um, Growing up in the West Coast, I'm very much so in the West Coast hip hop, but at the same time, the conscious rap, especially coming out the East Coast, right, was very much so part of my politicization.
Mhm.
And the Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie. um, then you had, what we call like, the hood movies, right, of the late 80s, 90s. So The Boys in the Hood, Menace to
Mhm.
Society. A lot of these different movies, like if they're not in Compton, because I'm born and raised in Compton. So if they're not in Compton, they're in the South LA area. And so I'm seeing, all these different other sorts of I'm being exposed, right?
Mhm.
A lot of different things. And like John Singleton, for example, had a very interesting way of weaving very important messages into the movie that even though at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, we may not necessarily have understood the message, the seed has been planted. And I think that it germinated in me later, but I was very much so informed by Dr. King's birthday. I was very much so informed by Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie, which led me to reading Malcolm's autobiography initially in my early mid teens. I didn't get it, but I read it. The seed was planted. So when I get to college, I went to Loyola Marymount University. And I actually did not go in. I actually went in to go into sports medicine, and I registered late. And so one of the last classes that I was able to get enrolled in was intro to it was African American studies at my institution. And Dr. Arletha Livingston, she's since remarried and changed her name, but um taught the course. And so at that point I'm exposed to this whole discipline. And it's interesting because I still remember at the beginning of like, oh, I'm black, she black. We talk about black folks, I'm gonna be good, right? And I didn't really read, didn't really focused on the task at hand, as unfortunately, a good handful of us did. Um, but then she had a way of checking all of us. And me and a friend of mine, kind of took that, like, okay, we can't half step through this. And we came back. We went to her office, apologized for not taking it serious, came back, and we basically took over the course after that. And I never really looked back. And so that class really kind of set me on my journey, even though I was still um, going into sports medicine. I got active on campus in terms of on campus and off campus organizations. I got active and participated in a couple of on campus and off campus activism efforts. I studied abroad in Ghana under Dr. Cheryl Grills. Um, and she was taking this trip, students to Ghana, every other year. And it fell in line with me to go in between my sophomore and junior year. And that's when I began to understand the difference between what I liked and what I had a passion for. I liked sports medicine. To this day, I still like sports medicine. I was a student athletic trainer for 3 years, and I was the, head manager for the men's basketball team for 2 years, so I was able to work with the basketball team as the manager, but also as a student athletic trainer and traveling around the country. I liked all of that, still do. But that trip to Ghana, my first trip, because I've been a couple times since then, but my first trip, that's what really helped me to understand that I actually had a passion for learning about, researching, and sharing with others the history, the culture, the experiences of African people and their descendants. And the thing that I never forgot was when we left um, Elmina dungeons. Some people call them castles. I can't call them castles. That's what the Europeans called them. There was our ancestors were in the dungeons, and so that's what I
Mhm.
refer to them as. But when we left the dungeons at Elmina, there's a plaque on the outside walking out. I'm paraphrasing, but it basically says, "In memory of our ancestors, may those of us who return find their roots. May those of us, who are the descendants and the living, we vow to make sure that this sort of tragedy never happens again. We, the living, vow to uphold this." I took that vow. Like, I read that and I made that vow right then and there as 19, 20 years old. And that really set me on the path to do what I'm doing now. What keeps me going is interesting because one is that vow that I took to our ancestors. But the other thing that really keeps me going is, so when I was a graduate student at Loyola Marymount, I was living not too far from campus, back on the west side of LA, but family and home, if you will, is still Compton. So one
Mhm.
day, instead of hopping on the freeway and driving home, something said, "Take the streets." So from the west side where I was staying to get to Compton, I'm going through South LA, through Watts, to get into Compton. And I'm not taking main streets, I'm hitting side streets too. And I'm seeing brothers and sisters on the block living ghetto fabulous, doing their thing. And I'm sitting here thinking to myself as I'm driving through the streets, hitting the side streets, knowing good and well I shouldn't be on some of these streets, but whatever directed me there, I listened. And I think I was on Western, getting ready to hit another side street, and something was like, "You can talk about ancient Kemet. You can talk about the, Nile Valley contributions to civilizations. You can talk about Ghana, Mali, Songhai. You can talk about, you know, um, enslavement, and you can talk about these great literary works and this and this. But what do you have to say that's going to move these brothers and sisters on the block? Why do they care about any of that?" And I never forgot that. And I think to this day, that question still informs my teaching. I think it also informs my research and my writing. It also informs which speaking engagements, that I'll take,
Mhm.
and the sort of code switching, if you will. But I never lose that part of me that is still from Compton, that part of me that's still very much so informed by a lot of those experiences. Um, but that kind of keeps me going. Is that it's the vow that I made outside of Elmina, along with the rhetorical question that I asked myself driving, through the streets those days, is what do I have to offer to them? And that kind of really gets me keeps me going.
So you said a lot in your response to how you got into Black Studies that really highlighted the commitment that you have to community and to Black people. Like, first, making a vow to the ancestors, and then going on this path that really inspired you to hold that community that you're from, to be accountable to them and to be able to reach people not just in the academy, but who are also on the block and who are everyday Black people who are living their lives in whatever ways they have to or choose to do in that moment. Um, and I want to ask you a little bit more about that in the ways in which you feel like that commitment has played out in your uh, academic trajectory, right? So with getting the PhD in cultural studies and having the certificate in African American studies, um, and then even the work you do now, how do you situate yourself and your commitment in relationship to the academic training that you've had?
That's a good question. So, I'm gonna go back and come forward. So, one of my first jobs, after finishing my undergrad, so I have 2 bachelor's degrees, one in African American. My first bachelor's degree is in African American Studies with a concentration in history. My second, bachelor's degree is in history with a concentration in Africa with a subfield in medieval European history.
Okay.
And so not a double major. I actually have 2 bachelor's degrees.
Mhm.
And so when I graduated with my bachelor's and I was like grad school was on the radar, but I hadn't really gotten going yet. So I took a job at the Community Coalition, which is a nonprofit organization in South LA. Um, it's not black people specific. It's community specific. It's South LA
Mhm.
specific. And so I'll never forget. I go in for my job interview and I'm being interviewed by 2 people. And one of them was Marquise Harris Dawson, who is now in the LA City Council. But he asked a question. He says, in the midst of all of this, of the interviewing session, he says, okay, so if the struggle is over tomorrow, and you can reshape the world however you like, how would you reshape the world?
Mm.
I had no answer for the question.
That's a big question.
I had no, and I actually said, I don't know, because it was so entrenched in the struggle that I didn't know what the end game looked like. And so I have spent the last 20 plus years trying to answer that question. And it's not an academic exercise for me.
Mhm.
I'm thinking about my parents and my grandparents. I'm thinking about aunts and uncles. I'm looking at folks I grew up with who aren't here anymore. I'm thinking about folks who are locked up doing long stretches, right? So when asked that question, it wasn't about a book I could write or a degree I could get. It was really about, you're doing all of this for what purpose?
Mm.
So when I'm teaching, yes, I'm getting paid for it. And I like my paycheck. Thank you. But for what purpose? What's the takeaway for the students beyond the learning outcomes and all of the academic fluff that we can give to it? What's the takeaway? Right? When I write a new article, who's it for? Is it for other PhDs? Because that's not why I got into doing what I'm doing. That doesn't mean that other PhDs can't read my work, but I want any literate person to be able to read my work and get it.
Mhm.
I want any literate person to be able to read my work, get it, and hopefully be encouraged, inspired, empowered to do something to make this world a little better than they inherited it, as my grandmother always told me. Right. And
Mhm.
so so to your question, that experience informs everything that I do. Even the committee work at the university. We were, for example, I was part of a committee that helped and brought a grant, not a grant, scholarship money on campus, for black students. And somebody comes in, they're like, oh, this would be really good. And especially like, for first year students and this and this. And wait a second, hold on. There's a lot of money that's available for first year students.
Mhm.
There's a lot of money that's available for first gen students.
Mhm.
But what about the students that's in their third, fourth, fifth year? Where's their scholarship money, right? And so um, we wound up changing some of the language. And this is nothing against first year students by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, I'm also thinking about the number of students who don't graduate, not because they can't make the grade, but because of financial obligations that take them out the university.
Uh-huh.
Right. And so to me, what I saw was an opportunity for this scholarship and later internship, paid internship that could help those who are in those last couple years, of their. So I'm always thinking about, those sorts of things. I was the marginal student, not horrible, but not great coming out of high school. I was the marginal student in college, not horrible, but not great. But it's because there were opportunities and resources, and people made the personal connections and took time to get to know me,
Mm-hmm.
and help this young, ambitious kid, to become more than what he thought he could be. And so yeah, it informs all of my work. I hope that answers your question, but it informs everything that I do.
Yeah, no, that is it. One, it answers the question, but two, I think it's a really important reminder of one, the purpose of Black Studies, and the ways in which it was founded, right? If we think about the desire and the demand by Black students to have themselves reflected in the curriculums, I think a big part of that is also the accessibility of information, um, which also goes back to your commitment to trying to engage in research and engage in work that reaches people in communities and not just people in academia, but taking care of or being mindful of those students who are in academia but have the barriers and the challenges to being able to finish, because getting to college is different than finishing. And
100%.
as you said, there are so many financial obligations that can prohibit someone who has all of the promise in the world of being able to finish. So that's a really important component that I do think is very much under emphasized in most places.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm glad you said that, and it is, um we give lip service. When I say we, I'm referring to the academy as a
Mhm.
whole. We give lip service to, well, I guess maybe before, this current administration, but we give lip service to the diversity, you know, um of our students on campus, and we give lip
Mhm.
service to their unique experiences out of the community in which they come. But we don't value enough collectively, both in the academy, and dare I say, some of us in the Ebony Tower don't come out of the Ebony Tower enough to connect and stay connected with the community in which birthed us, in a very real sense, birthed us as our, individuals, selves, but birthed this discipline as well.
Mhm.
I said I'm born and raised in Compton, but as I'm doing this interview with you right now, I'm sitting in my home in Compton, right? So I didn't leave Compton,
Mhm.
if you will. I'm still here, not to give back, but to be a part of. So I know that is not, you know, um, going to be everyone's trajectory for whatever varying different reasons, right? Some of us in academia have to go across the country just to get a job, even though we didn't necessarily want to leave, quote unquote home. If you want to have a job, you got to go where the jobs are available. So you may have to uproot yourself and go someplace else. I get that. I know I've been very, very blessed in that respect to not have to uproot myself, and go other places. But um, to have, as you said, the accessibility. I'm very mindful of what work I publish where. So the work that I want to be accessible to any and all, I look for outlets that is available online. And then for those that I may be speaking more so to an academic audience, then I'll publish in some of these, the scholarly journals, that you have to have a subscription to, either you personally, or your institution has
Mhm.
a subscription to. So, but I'm very conscious, and I actually have more of the shorter, accessible pieces than the longer, quote unquote, scholarly pieces that, for other academics.
Mhm.
But that's a choice that I've made, and if I get, I have tenure, but if I get promoted, to full and all that, by writing this line of, the community engagement, accessible pieces along with the academic pieces, then I'll be on cloud nine. That's why I got into this, is to um be able to do the academic scholarly work, but also to speak to the people, if you will, as Malcolm X used to say, got to speak to the people.
I think that that's such an important point, and something that is, to me, increasingly important. Not that it ever was unimportant, but I think that particularly in this political social moment that we're living in, that accessibility is necessary, um, for Black studies. Because there needs to be more the ability to have the collaboration, and I really like how you said being a part of rather than giving back to your community. Like, the ability to be a part of the community in this moment is necessary, um, because work is happening outside of the ivory and ebony towers in ways that needs to be acknowledged and recognized and engaged with, and regardless of what happens in academic spaces with regards to the institution of Black studies, it continues in the streets.
That's
And
right.
but if you're not a part of the communities, then you might not be able to engage in that work in the same ways or see what's happening beyond, the talks or the journal publications.
Agreed.
So, thank you. That's a really important reminder and a really good way to frame, um, thinking about the type of work that happens in Black studies and should be happening in Black studies. So, how do you see that commitment in the work that you do? How does that influence your teaching and your pedagogy?
Yeah. So one of the first pieces that I wrote years ago was called Reflections of an Edutainer. And I remember getting that language, edutainment,
Mhm.
from Boogie Down Productions, right? KRS-One Edutainment. But one of my mentors, Dr. David Horn, said that to be a good classroom instructor, you have to be 50% entertainer and 50% educator. And that never, was lost on me. So, how to inform while keeping the students' interest. So that doesn't mean that I'm going to go out there and um, act a fool. but it does mean that to keep their interest, figure out how to be engaging. Now, some people think about engagement with um, let's have them do collaborative work and get them moving around the classroom, and I do that as well. But that's not enough. What I mean by that is, like, if some of my evaluations from the students is, he's very passionate about what he does. He's very into what he's doing, right? And so day in and day out, what the students get from me is my best. And
Mhm.
in that best, there's a lot of energy. It is not lost on me also that in part it's a performance. That does not mean that I don't know my stuff. I know my stuff. But how can I communicate that in the classroom in a way that gets you to not only understand it, but also keep you engaged and informed and, dare I say, on the edge of your seat, right? And so there's a diversity of different ways in doing that. And I think that that in part comes from my studying of classical and indigenous African socialization practices.
Mm.
And so whether we talk about the griot or whatever different communities of people right around the African continent, you have those who have the task, the responsibility of sharing information, passing on the history and the culture of the family and the community, right? And this can be through song, this can be through dance, this can be through proverbs, this can be through riddles, this can be through narratives or storytelling, right? And so all of these different sort of approaches, I'm like, it wasn't about the pedagogical approach itself,
Mm-hmm.
because as instructors, and you know this as well, right? There's a new workshop every week on some new pedagogical practice that has, that's proven to do this, this, and this.
Yeah.
And my grandmother taught LAUSD for nearly 40 years. And I was young in my career when she passed, so I didn't get a chance to really have some of these conversations with her as an educator. My conversations with her was as a grandson, but my wife's grandmother also taught LAUSD for nearly 40 years. And so I asked her one day, I said, all these different pedagogical practices and strategies and this over the years, are they really any better than the other? And she's like, baby, no. No, they all do what they're supposed to do. But what do you, as the instructor, bring to the approach? That is what makes the approach. It's what you, as the instructor, bring to the table.
Mhm.
All of them are good, she said, but which one works for you? And so I never forgot that. And I think it actually released me, if you will, from being restricted, if not constricted, by the scholars and academicians and practitioners who say these are the best practices. And people are
Mhm.
always asking, okay, Keith, you're so good with these students and this and this. What are some of the best practices that you use? I'm like, look, I can tell you what I do in the classroom, but you can't be me. Like, I teach minutes
Mhm.
away from where I grew up.
Yeah.
I connect with my students on a very real level in the neighborhoods in which they grew up in, because it's a neighborhood that I grew up in. I speak their language in a very real way, right? I can make reference to the music, not as a, yes, I've heard about that. Oh, yes, that was very good, right? No, because I listen to that too, right? I'm the same age as their parents. And so, these sorts of things, right? So all of it, who I am and my upbringing comes into the classroom. So if I want to do a mock conversation between W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, I'll do that. If I need to have, or I need to do I'll give you an example of what I mean. Here's a good example. And I don't do this in every single class, but the one that where it fits. So I told you that I did my undergraduate study abroad in Ghana. And so I have my pictures that I took and I put it into a slideshow. And in the slideshow from Asan Manso, or the quote unquote, the slave river, where folks took the last bath,
Mhm.
to Elmina Dungeon and to Cape Coast Dungeon. I have this whole thing. And I created unintentionally, but it happened nonetheless, fairly organically, my own narrative about that journey that our ancestors would have gone through. And I tell them, put down your pens, don't worry about taking notes. I want you to listen, right? And so here's this whole experience that I'll take them through, to make it as real as possible. So now the reading hopefully comes to life. Now, hopefully, the historical moment becomes more real. we start having questions about, and I'm drawing here from Dr. Naeem Akbar. What is the process of making a slave, he asks. And we'll have all of that up on the board. And I'm getting real theatrical about it. No, we got to make them. How we going to make them? Be specific. We got to make these slaves because they weren't born slaves. We got to make them slaves, And so we go through this whole thing, and I'm being very performative with this, right? And then I'll go through, to kind of like drive the point home. I'll make connections to house training a pet. So I'll say it jokingly, where did you get, how many of y'all got cats? You got dogs. I mean, did you go and get it? Did you select it? Did the mama, dog say, oh, please, by all means, take that puppy. I call him Griff, but please feel free to change the name. I'll do all these sorts of things. You got a dog that, darts out as soon as you open the door and leave it open too long. Cause you gotta, then you gotta run out there and chase them, with your chains. I'm sorry, with your leash. Do you put up signs that says, run away? I'm sorry, lost dog. I do stuff like this, right? Or do you have a good slave? I'm sorry, a good pet that stays there at the open door who says, I ain't going nowhere. It's good where I got it. So I'll take them through these sorts of things. And then we come back to, again, drawing from Dr. Naeem Akbar, once the slave has been made, how do you free the slave? Oh, I'm telling you, when I ask, how do you make them? I can fill up the whole board in the room. When I ask, how do you free them? Silence. Like the Allstate commercial, silence, right? And that silence is more telling than all the things that they said to fill up the board, right? So it becomes engaging. It's performative I can really leave out of class sometimes like I had a full workout because of how much I'm giving to, that 75 minutes, of that particular class, like that. So my research, but also trying to remember, what do I have to say? What do I have to do, to speak to in a very real way the students in the classroom? All of it kind of informs what I do. So I hope that answers your question, but all of it informs what I do.
It does. And it also makes me want to take your class, because I think that to have that type of structure, and as well as like the flexibility to like have students really consider these things and consider them deeply, to provide the examples that they can connect with, to really think about, okay, what does it mean to take an individual, take a human being, and place them in a context within which they don't know anything about, they're not used to, they don't know what's coming, but it's going to, but they have to behave in a certain way within this particular context. So how do you communicate that information, and take away, break their spirit so that they won't leave? I think that the juxtaposition between how you make someone a slave versus how do you make someone free, and the importance of the question of freedom, is so, to set that up and then allow students to really sit in, we understand how to oppress someone, or there are blueprints that we are familiar with on how to break somebody, not so much to free someone, which is not to say that they don't exist, but they're not as readily talked about or communicated or conveyed in ways that are visible to students, which I think goes back to the accessibility piece, right? There's a lot of academic writing and text and research that has gone into thinking about both of these questions, but the things that our students come having most familiarity with are not necessarily the things that are going to serve to help free them, or they don't acknowledge or recognize the tools that they have that can be used to free themselves, which again is increasingly important right now.
That is.
thank you. That was super interesting and important it's particularly that specific example. So thank you for that. So as someone who has a background, you have degrees in history with a concentration in Africa and medieval European history, which is really interesting, actually. I'm curious about that. But having your doctorate in cultural studies with certificate in Africana studies, and then working in Black studies with a deep commitment to the role and engagement with community in Black studies, what interests you most about the past of the field?
So I'm definitely going to get to that question because it's a good question. But just real quick about the medieval European history.
Yeah.
Why did I do that? Why did I do that to myself? Because I had a growing interest, by the time I declared that, if it was a Black class at Loyola Marymount, I had taken it.
Mm.
Or I was going to take it in the next semester or two. I basically took all the classes that dealt with Black folks in like whatever, unit on campus. It's just what I did. But I got to the point to where I wanted to understand, who are these people? And why did they come out of Europe with an attitude?
Great
So what was
question.
going on before, if I can just blanketly say 1500, what was going on before 1500 up over there to where they came out of there with an attitude problem, when they interacted with everybody else in the rest of the world? And so I'm making jokes, but I'm being very serious. These are the things that I was thinking at 19, 20 years old. So, so I did a, subfield in medieval European history. Now, am I an expert or anything like that? No, not by any stretch of the imagination. But do I have a working understanding of Europe and Europeans from about, the 10th through the 15th, 16th century? You better believe I do. A working understanding to help me to understand. Once I began to understand that, I got a better understanding of why and how they began to go around the world, acquiring territory, enslaving peoples, and colonizing peoples. So it was necessary, and I think that sometimes some of us, we've gotten so focused on studying ourselves, and understandably so, that we don't always go back and study our oppressor. So so if I put this in war terms, you don't go into war without knowing your opponent. I played basketball since I was about 5 years old. Well, my knees and my back don't let me do it anymore, but I still, and a good scouting report to know what I'm up against so I can, be able to adjust my strategy and my plans, right? That just makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And so why would this be any different? You need to have a working understanding. If we're going to talk about Western culture, European culture, and history and philosophy, so we need to study it, which is one of the reasons why I appreciate Marimba Ani's Yorugu, an Afrocentric approach to understanding European thought and behavior. I'm not saying that I understood or even agree with everything that she wrote in there, but I am saying that it got me thinking more deeply about what informed their thoughts and their behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I appreciated that book, because that's the first book that I read that examined Europeans from an African-centered perspective. But the concentration area, or the subfield in the history department, did not give me that lens, but it did give me the information, right? And which is just as important. So your question, I'm sorry. Well, you had a central question that you just asked me, and I went off on a tangent and forgot the question.
No, so one, I appreciate the tangent because I do think that one, it's interesting that you you had a concentration in medieval European history, and I think that really speaks to the uh the drive and the motivation that you had to actually understand, okay, what was happening that created what was the context within which this situation arose, and how, like, why did they decide to do these things in this way? And I think that that's really important, because I have never had the desire to study medieval European history, right? And I might think about that in more contemporary times, think about that maybe, uh 18th, 19th century to present, but to go back and to understand it in its foundations and its um origins, I think is it really speaks to having a more holistic understanding of maybe where we are now, right? Thinking about what is the trajectory that has happened based upon these actions that were taken in the 10th century, which ain't all that long ago in, in
It's
the
really
grand
not.
scheme of stuff, right? Like,
It's really not.
this hasn't been a very long trajectory, um, in general. So that was an important tangent. I'm glad that you took it. The question, which I think also goes along with the tangent that you took, is what interests you most about the past of Black studies? And then in both, like, what excites you about it, but maybe what do you think we can be not necessarily critical of, but what do you think are things for us to keep in mind, um, that maybe weren't so great in the past, that we can make sure we are mitigating and accounting for in our present?
Yeah. So, um, about the past of the. So one of my areas of focus is the Black freedom movement. In generally speaking, my
Mhm.
focus is here in Los Angeles. Um, and so much of my work in the movement, Black studies, as a part of that, is the intellectual work of the people. Oftentimes we get into the spectacle,
Mhm.
the marches, the protests, the shootouts with the police, the building takeovers, and all that is important. And I would never do anything to diminish that. What I want to do is elevate the intellectual work and the creative agency of the people. So when we take a look at the Black freedom movement, they were envisioning a new world, a new country, a new society that hadn't been created yet. But they had to envision something
Mhm.
so that they could achieve something better. When Black Studies was created, it was created as part of a broader freedom movement, but it also, in its own creative agency, sought to reconceptualize, redefine higher ed.
Mhm.
And I think that our discipline has been very successful in the last 50 years or so of recreating higher ed to varying degrees. You have different departments and disciplines who are engaging issues of race and class and gender and so on and so forth in ways that they would not have done 50 years ago.
Mhm.
And that conversation begins with Black studies, and our allies, in American Indian studies, Asian American studies, Chicano Latino studies, women and gender studies. We have to. That's part of it. But Black studies kicks open the door, and so we have been very successful, I think, at redefining the purpose and expanding the reach of higher ed. And so that is part of what really keeps me going also, because we don't know what tomorrow holds.
Mhm.
We don't know, and this is why 5-year plans and, all the other sorts of things, because we're constantly thinking and rethinking ourselves in relation to our college, in relation to the university, in relation to society, the state, the country, the world, right? We're always rethinking it, but it's always to, in the broadest sense of it, it's always in the broadest context of freedom, in a both conceptually and practically. Freedom in the broadest sense, right? And so that keeps our discipline grounded, but it also keeps it dynamic. So both are happening simultaneously. And so when we have people who juxtapose the past of our discipline with the present of our discipline, I don't understand that juxtaposition, because we're responding to our current historical moment. And so the moment in 1979 is not the same moment as 1969, which is not the same moment as 1999 or 2019.
Yeah.
We're responding to that historical moment from the same grounded position. And that is a continued quest for freedom in the broadest sense. For Black folks, for people of for African people and their descendants, and the whole of the world. We're responding to our present moment and trying to create something better, moving forward. And so I think that we have been very successful in staying grounded while responding to the historical moment, the present moment. Now, sometimes we begin to critique ourselves, and sometimes I think we offer critique of ourselves without looking at what is the moment that that individual or that group or that department is referring to. Because what's happening on campus X may not be the same as happening to campus W or campus J. Right. And so as a result, that department has to respond uniquely to that institution. But there are some things that I think that we could, build upon, we could strengthen. We have professional organizations, like the National Council of Black Studies. I would like to see more of us attend the NCBS conference. I would like to see us, like some other organizations, have regional organizations as part of NCBS. We don't have to wait for the annual one where nationally everybody comes together. We can do something regionally, right? So we can be in community with each other across campuses, and organize ourselves regionally, in that respect. And I think about this because I know that the Association of Black Psychologists, or ABPSI, has this, right? I wouldn't see that as a fault or a limitation, because I know that NCBS as an organization has its own challenges, and then each institution has its own challenge. Some of it may be funding in terms of people getting there. Some of it may be, the funding, that different scholars or institutions get from, whether it's the Ford Foundation or whoever, that may inform the direction of the scholarship. That may put people at ideological odds, even though conceptually they're on the same page, right? And so I think that's some of the things that we can do better to advance and move forward, is to build institutional relationships. We have the personal relationships, but do we have institutional relationships, from department to department in our respective geographical region? That could strengthen us if we have the regional alliances, the regional organizations, as well as the national. So there's a lot of things that I think that we've done well in And there's a lot of challenges that still need to be addressed, moving forward at the same time. But what does our historical, what does our present moment prioritize us to do is also part of that conversation, because some of the contemporary priority may not lend itself
Mhm.
to the other ambitious organizational and collective goal and strategy, because we have some very uh, present struggles that we have to tend to also. But I think that we could also, I know that for, like the first, generation or two of our scholars have really been establishing the discipline and, laying down its legitimacy as a viable academic enterprise. I think part of this generation of work is to continue advancing that quality academic work of the previous generations, while also communicating to our youth, to their parents, and to our communities the practical day-to-day value of our discipline, as well as the practical uh, hard and soft skills that you will receive leading to employment.
Yeah.
And I think once we are able to communicate that, then we, in this contemporary moment, I think it strengthens us again moving forward. So I know
Thank
I just said a lot there, but I hope I answered that question. I thought I just said a lot.
No, you definitely did. I think that, the importance of the historical moment that Black studies is engaging with and responding to is integral in thinking about what happened at any particular point in its trajectory. Um, and you can't, you can't divorce anything from its context. So none of the decisions that are made or the research that's done or the activism that takes place happens in a vacuum. It all is operating in the broader social context. And I think that you're very right that our current social context requires that we emphasize the practical value of Black studies to everyday life, um, in a way that is accessible and in a way that is, um, it demonstrates not just the academic knowledge, but, what you can use with the skills, like you said, the hard skills and the soft skills that can come from a focus on or centering of Black people and Black communities and the goal of freedom in its broadest context and freedom for Black people. So you definitely answered the question, but that was also, I
Okay,
think that there's
good,
lots of
good.
important reminders in that. And you kind of like the need to emphasize that practical value. I think that is one thing that we could definitely emphasize moving forward. Are there additional things that interest or excite you about the future of the field and where we can or should be going beyond making sure that we are engaged with and um, a part of community?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. One of the things that um, has my interest right now is, in the academy, how much value we place on critical thinking.
Mhm.
And I've been teaching a critical thinking class since I started at Cal State Long Beach in 2016. And when I started teaching it, I saw that in my search for a viable textbook, that we didn't have one. And so I'm struggling to connect and make things work and what have you, because a lot of the point of departure for understanding critical thinking still comes out of at its base, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, right? And so one of my early articles in 2020 was called "Putting Some Soul into Critical Thinking." And so in that piece and works that I've been developing, since then, is that we need to develop and advance a concept and practice of critical thinking that is grounded in African African diasporic ways of knowing. So I'll ask my students in class, take Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle out of the equation. Who can give me ancient philosophers and thinkers from anywhere in the world, not Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle? And more times than not, the class is silent. And so in that silence, the question then is asked, are we suggesting that these other communities of people around the world did not have any great thinkers, any great philosophers and sages, if you will, in their communities? Answer's no. So it's our task then, it's our responsibility then to research, recover, and update, some of the things that those ancient philosophers, if I can call them that, we're wrestling with. Who are we? How do we know what we've come to know, and these sorts of things? Because if culture informs our thoughts and our behavior, then that means then that critical thinking has a cultural component. And if critical thinking has a cultural component, but we're only getting the foundation of critical thinking from a European philosophy or European, cultural point of departure, then some of us may be unintentionally reproducing some of the same thoughts, ideas, conclusions that are anti-African, that are anti-Black, right? In some of our best efforts, because we're at our core, some of the basic assumptions when we think of things, in terms of their epistemology, their ontology, the axiology, on that deep level, if we're not engaging it from that deep cultural level, then we run the risk of reproducing some of those same ideas, some of those same concepts. And so that is where I am right now, is investigating classical and indigenous African cultural practices, philosophical ideas, right, that we can draw upon, update, and then use and employ, right, in our contemporary, in this contemporary moment and in this geographic location, right? Because just because it worked in the Nile Valley doesn't mean that it's going to work in Compton, right? So how do we update it and make sense of it in our contemporary circumstances, right? And so that's where I am right now. And so I have a couple pieces that I've written on what I'm calling, African deep thought. It's not my concept. I'm borrowing from Jacob Crothers and Asa Hilliard, but my intention is to write a piece that is usable, digestible for late high school, early college students, that college instructors can, or community programs can use and assign to get us hopefully to start thinking deeply from a culturally grounded, not culturally relevant, but culturally grounded point of departure. So that's where I am. And that's one of the things that interests me. And I think that it's going to be pivotal moving forward, I think anyway, in our discipline of really carving out space, because it's addressing, I think, what Ibram Kendi refers to as, these anti-Black racist ideas. We're very clear on the anti-Black racist practices. What about the anti-Black racist ideas? We need to actually know how to engage those, but what alternative are we providing ourselves? It's one thing to critique it. It's another thing to provide an alternative. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in moving forward.
Well, thank you so much. That is, I think that the importance of not just critique, but alternative is another very important reminder, right? Because, we can talk about it and we can say what's wrong, but what are we going to do instead? And there needs to be an instead
That's right.
option Because if there's not, then yeah, we're talking about it and we're still having to operate within the same systems and structures in a way that continues to not serve us. So
That's right.
I think that's a great place for us to end it. But is there anything you would like to add or
No,
any
I
final thoughts?
no, I think that's it. Thank you, to you and your colleague John um for this series. It's been great. I've listened to a great deal of them, and so I'm honored to be able to contribute to it.
Well, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for all of your insightful answers and reminders. I took tons of notes. So I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time and your leadership on this project as well.
Thanks. Have a great day.
You do the same. Take care.